Was your father's heart attack avoidable in your view? If you think about the lifestyle choices and things like that you talked about your mother there, was that avoidable in any sense of the word?
Yeah, interesting. So there are two components to my dad's death. Strictly, the post-mortem findings didn't reveal a heart attack per se, but for all intents and purposes, it can be seen that way. So the first thing that happened was my dad, by the way, was a very fit man. For his age, 73 years old, played badminton every week, had a bit of high blood pressure, but had got that better controlled after quitting sugar, partly because of all my campaigning. And he listened to me and he was very into eating healthy food. In fact, I consider myself to be extremely fit. I'm obsessed with exercise. I played a lot of competitive sport when I was younger, partly because of him. And it was very unexpected when he called me up. It's coming up to his anniversary, July 26, 2021. And he said, Aseem, I've got some chest discomfort. And I asked him, to describe it. In medicine, 80% of your diagnosis, if you're a good doctor, comes from the conversation. So the way he described his chest discomfort was a central heaviness going to his shoulders. So immediately you think, this is heart. And I said, you need to call an ambulance. He was a bit reluctant to call an ambulance for whatever reason. And then I said, okay, I was in London. He was in Manchester. That's where I grew up. And I decided to go and have a shower, get ready and get on the train. And he was ringing up his neighbors who were both doctors. And by the time I came out of the shower, I called him back and there was no answer. And I remember my heart just thinking, I really hope he's not had a cardiac arrest. I thought, no, this can't be what's going on. Kept ringing. And eventually the neighbor who was a doctor who knew me, she answered the phone and said, Aseem, your dad's had a cardiac arrest. We're doing CPR on him. I know from national data, and I've even written about this in the BMJ, the average response time, Steve, for many, many years. One of the things that we have done very well in the NHS, some of the best in the world, is our treatment of heart attacks and the speed of treatment and even cardiac arrests. I knew the average response time was 8 minutes. I said the ambulance will be here in 8 minutes. Because of the timing, almost certainly he will have what we call a shockable rhythm, as in the heart is probably having a electrical disturbance and we'll be able to shock him out of it. More than 50% chance he will survive. I'm thinking already like this. 10 minutes pass by, ambulance hasn't shown. 20 minutes, nothing. 30 minutes, they get there and I FaceTime them. They attach the cardiac monitor. It's a flat line. He's gone. Nothing to be done. And of course, that was, at that stage, I was obviously devastated. And I wrote in the newspaper about how I screamed louder than ever I've screamed in my life. But to come back to that situation first and foremost. So the first thing is, if the ambulance had turned up on time, almost certainly it's likely he would have survived. That's the first thing. But the second thing in my mind is, why has he had a cardiac arrest in the first place? He was a really healthy guy. And in my family, as in on his side, there was no family history of heart disease. He had high blood pressure, okay, but that was about it, right? And he was otherwise pretty good. And when the postmortem came back, there were 3 major arteries of the heart. 2 of them had severe blockages. And I thought, this is odd, because I knew his lifestyle. This is my area of interest and expertise, heart disease specifically, how it progresses, how you can reverse it, all that stuff, what medications can do, what they can't do as well. And I thought to myself, hold on, I knew his scan from a few years earlier. Something has happened in the last 2 or 3 years that has caused a rapid acceleration in the disease of the heart, right? In terms of the blockages getting very rapidly, progressing. And I thought, this doesn't make sense. And I thought to myself, was he just severely stressed? Like, stress can do it. Very severe stress can do it. He'd lost, obviously, my mum a couple of years earlier, but he was a very resilient guy. He was a vice president of the British Medical Association. He was still involved in medical politics. During COVID, he was one of the faces on the BBC during the COVID pandemic, talking about, how we should manage this, etc. So he was still very mentally active. He wasn't a recluse sitting in the corner. He was still social. So it doesn't really fit. And then a publication appeared in the journal Circulation, which is considered the premier cardiology journal. And a cardiologist called Stephen Gundry, who you may have heard of, he's done a lot of work on lifestyle and lectins and stuff. So he actually had a very senior role in the American Heart Association, very eminent published cardiologist. He published an abstract where he'd looked at several hundred of his patients who had taken the COVID vaccines. specifically mRNA vaccines, so either Pfizer or Moderna, 2 doses. And what had happened was, within 8 weeks of taking those jabs, their baseline risk went from 11% chance of a heart attack in 5 years to 25% chance just within 8 weeks. That is a huge jump. Like, just to give you perspective, Steve, if I today decided that I was going to just consume junk food, all my meals, right? I was going to smoke 20 cigarettes a day. I was going to stop exercising. I wouldn't get anywhere close to increasing my risk within 8 weeks. And the mechanism was through inflammation. And I thought, I know heart disease is a chronic inflammatory condition linked to lifestyle. So if this is even partially true, it means that the COVID vaccines may be causing inflammation around the heart. And that means that many people are going to have an acceleration in heart disease. And that may explain what happened to my dad. But that was only one bit of data. Of course, a good scientist knows, okay, it gets you thinking. It's a hypothesis, potentially. Obviously, there's some data, but it's not enough to make it more than likely at this stage. And within 2 weeks, call it Providence or whatever else, I got a phone call from somebody who I know. I consider him one of the smartest cardiologists, very high integrity, from a very prestigious institution. And he called me up and he said, Aseem, I've got something to tell you. I'm very upset. He said, a group of researchers that I'm linked to in this institution had accidentally found, and this has nothing to do with blood tests or cardiac risk, through a very high-tech imaging of the heart modality they were using, that there was inflammation of the arteries, which would cause obviously potentially heart attacks, that was there in the vaccinated, but not there in the unvaccinated. The lead researcher sat the team down and he said, guys, I just want to make this clear. We are not going to explore these findings any further because it may affect our funding from the drug industry. Now, obviously people hearing this are going to think, wow, sounds corrupt. This is something that has been a big problem within medicine for a very, very long time, which isn't getting an airing. But it didn't surprise me of that, but it was still quite shocking. But for me at that stage, Steve, it was, okay, at the very least, I should ask the question. And I was nervous about it. I had been someone, took the jab myself. I went to Good Morning Britain, and very early on, when they were just offering it to high-risk people, to say that I think that this is probably safe and people shouldn't be worried. And this was, again, specifically to address people from Black and ethnic minority communities, because there was a lower uptake amongst those communities, partly also because they are often amongst some of the most marginalized members of society, and they have less trust in authority and government. So you can see how the psychology plays in there. And I convinced a friend of mine who's a film director, Gurinder Chadha, who directed Bend It Like Beckham. You might know some of her movies. And we went on together in Good Morning Britain to say, listen, I think this is fine. So I had all of that. And so I was, in many ways, I was indoctrinated. And there is, and people don't like to admit they're wrong or think they've got it wrong. So for me to start turning or changing my mind or asking the question is not necessarily an easy thing to do, but I've done that throughout my career. So, if anyone has the character, I know myself, to be able to say, listen, okay, there's new evidence here, whatever else, I felt I could do that. But I was still nervous. And I thought, this is not something that I think the BBC are going to pick up on. I had a good rapport with GB News at that point. And I still do. And one of the presenters, Alexandra Phillips, was a friend of mine. And I called her up and said, listen, she wanted me on anyway. I was doing regular health slots every few weeks. I said, Aseem, what do you want to talk about next week? And I said, I think let's talk about this. She said, okay, go on GB News. I say, the vaccine committee of the country should look into this. This is what I know. This is what I found. Whistleblower, all this stuff. I said, my dad died as well, and this may be the reason for his death. And I just asked that question. And of course, I didn't expect it to go viral. It got millions of views and it was getting reach all over America and that kind of thing. Strangely, by this point, Steve, I don't know if you remember, but Omicron wave had started. And we were getting reports from South Africa, which was really reassuring, that from the doctor that discovered it, that this doesn't seem to be more harmful than the flu now. Great. Okay, it's mutated, it's a different strain. This is really great news. And then Sajid Javid, around the same time, the Secretary for Health, had come out in Parliament and said, we are now going to pass through legislation that the COVID vaccine needs to be mandated for healthcare workers. despite the fact that the British Medical Association, medical Royal colleges, we've never, in our country, one thing that's really good, especially within the medical establishment, we don't believe in mandating any drug. They do this in America. They've never done this here. And although they weren't very vocal about it, they kind of were a bit relatively quiet. They weren't supporting it openly, saying that we should mandate. This was coming from this political decision. I said, this is very odd. At a stage now where we're thinking there's serious harm, we know it's not, and by that stage, 2021, November, most people are understanding now it wasn't stopping infection, right, for most people, right? So I said, this doesn't make any sense. So I then started campaigning on this issue. And I started campaigning on this issue and was able to get into the mainstream news on this particular issue because around that time, the I newspaper had published an investigation into the delay that led to my dad's death of the ambulance service, right? And I had also got privy to knowledge in that, in that story that the deputy chief nurse of NHS England had called me up and said there'd been basically a cover-up by the government and the Department of Health to stop people knowing for months there were ambulance delays, doctors and members of the public. And I thought, this is unacceptable. So I exposed this. It became a massive story, BBC News. And when the BBC presenter was saying, Dr. Malhotra, what's going on wrong with the NHS? Why is it failing? Why is this happening? I said, it's multifactorial, but I said, one of the most important reasons is we failed for years to address the root cause of what's driving stress on the system, taking on the excesses of big food and big pharma. But I said, right now, we've got 80 to 100,000 NHS staff who are refusing to have the COVID vaccine. This would be a crisis. They're going to lose their jobs. This mandate needs to be overturned. It's not scientific. It's not ethical. So I got that into the mainstream, and ultimately we end up overturning, right, the mandate. But there was a backlash, Steve, behind the scenes, and I've not been public about this before. So I'm going to tell you this for the first time because I think it's time I tell this story. Shortly after me going on GB News, as a doctor who'd had the vaccine, had been on Good Morning Britain to say it was likely safe and effective, to then talking about we should maybe look into this and maybe pause the situation because of these heart issues that need to be investigated. I received an email from the Royal College of Physicians. This is the oldest medical institution in the world, saying, Dr. Malhotra, we have received a number of anonymous complaints from other fellows that you, in reference to my GB News interview, that you are spreading anti-vax misinformation, and you've got 4 weeks to respond to this. And they were saying all the different sanctions that could happen because of me doing this, right? Steve, at that point, I thought, if we are going to get a pause on this vaccine and really investigate it, it's because of such an indoctrination, because so many people, billions of people around the world have taken this, and therefore the battle to expose it is going to be harder than anything I've ever done. The only way in, my only chance, is to get it published in a peer-reviewed journal and then to get it into the news. I spent 9 months at that stage, literally eating, breathing, sleeping, speaking to 2 Pfizer whistleblowers, speaking to eminent scientists in expertise I didn't have around immunology and vaccine development. Of course, I had the understanding of cardiology, better than anybody in this particular field, in this particular area. And when I did that research and looked at it, I first of all concluded that there absolutely needs to be a suspension of the vaccine, because what happened by the summer of 2022, and this is actually the most crucial and important piece of data on its own, which should have been enough to suspend it and actually suggest that it probably shouldn't have been rolled out in the first place, is that those trials that were done by Pfizer and Moderna, which led to all the media reports, 95, 100% effective, the approval by the regulator, the rollout, the coercion, the mandates, they were reanalyzed by some very eminent scientists, including the associate editor of the BMJ, one of the world's top epidemiologists, and they published in the journal Vaccine, which is the premier journal for vaccines. And they were able to get new data that was made available on Health Canada's website and the FDA in America's website. And what they did in their reanalysis of the original high-quality clinical trials is they found, Steve, you were more likely to suffer serious harm from taking the vaccine at a rate of 1 in 800. That meant hospitalization, disability, or a life-changing event, than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. And this is during the early phase.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.